Hello and welcome back to the Illumination Lectures, and today we're going to talk about the Exodus. Yeah, the famous Exodus, and this is taken from one of my first books. This is Jesus' Last of the Pharaohs, which actually starts back in the Old Testament. It goes on to the life of Jesus, of course, but it starts back in the Old Testament to have a look at his ancestry. And yeah, that has a lot of information from the Exodus within that particular book. And then that was, the next book in that series was Tempest and Exodus. And as the title might tell you, that is all about the Exodus and also the Tempestella of Pharaoh Ahmose I, which we're going to look at in this talk. So in the lecture I did on King Solomon, it's I think just the last lecture on King Solomon, we've seen the close links between the Israelites and Egypt. But where did these links begin? Were these links simply because the Israelites were slaves in Egypt? Or is there a deeper association with Egypt? Well, personally, I think there is a much closer link to Egypt than mere slavery. They were just stories for children, as we will see later in this particular talk. As we've already seen, Kings David and King Solomon and Jesus were real kings, powerful and influential individuals. And David and Solomon, as we've seen, were most probably pharaohs of Egypt, pharaohs of Lower Egypt in the Nile Delta. So did these important kings spring from a band of shepherds wandering around with a few sheep? Or is there a deeper meaning to these enduring tales, this enduring history as it is becoming likely that it is? Well, I think there's been a cover-up of sort of epic proportions, a sort of millennial distortion of the truth, because the truth was too troubling for the people who were peddling it to their people. And so the truth has never previously surfaced because it is still too troubling for many people, especially theologians, but also we see this in the academic world with Egyptologists and historians. And we can begin to see this troublesome history in the accounts of the Exodus. Because the Exodus is the pivotal event in Judaic history. This is the event that is central to the culture and history and mythology of the Israelite people. It's sort of essentially the event that created the Judaic peoples. Everything goes back to the Exodus and them being thrown out of Egypt. That's what consolidated their people into a cultural unity. And I say that the Exodus is mythology because there is an odd thing about this Exodus epic in that it cannot be found in the historical record. Same old, we've seen this time and time again. And here's the classical Exodus. This is Moses and his people down below and the waters parting so that they can pass through away from the evil Egyptians and escape from Egypt. And yet none of this can be found in the historical record. And we've seen this time and time again with Jesus and Saul and all of the New Testament events not being obviously visible in the historical record. David and Solomon not being there in the archaeological record of Jerusalem, just simply not there. As the archaeologists said, Finkelstein and Silverman, Jerusalem was no more than a village at the time of the united monarchy of Kings David and Solomon. So it's missing from the historical record, and to find that united monarchy, we had to go back into Egypt and find them in Tanis, in Zoan instead of Zion. And here we have the same problem, because the Exodus cannot be found in the historical record. This huge event with 500,000 people going from Egypt to Jerusalem, and it cannot be found in the historical record. Now, they say that that's because they were nomadic at the time. Obviously, they were living in tents and they're not going to leave any traces in the land, but there should be traces in the landscape. I mean, things like the destruction of Jericho, for instance. That should be visible in the historical record, and it's not. Well, it may be, actually, but it's not under the classical scheme of things. So what is the Exodus? Just as a quick reminder, I'm sure you all know the story, but as a quick reminder, it was a period of storms and darkness. There was dust, there was hail, there was the waters parting, there was the pillar of fire and smoke. There was this big battle with the Egyptians, the evil Egyptians that were trying to throw these slaves out of Egypt, or rather the slaves were trying to have their freedom and escape from Egypt. And 500,000 of these shepherds, they were called shepherds, remember. The patriarchs were all called shepherds. They all went on this great exodus. They finally escaped from Egypt and they went to Jerusalem. That's the story. Now, the interesting thing is, did you know that there was an identical exodus to this event? And if not, why not? Why don't you know that there was a parallel historical Exodus event that's exactly the same as the biblical Exodus? Why don't you know? Well, we'll have a look at that in a minute. But the other Exodus, what is this other Exodus? So the parallel historical Exodus is the Exodus of the Hyksos people from Egypt. Some people call it Hyksos. I call it Hyksos. Manetho, the Egyptian historian, gives both versions. So we're going to stick with Hyksos on this one. So who were the Hyksos? Well, they were Asiatics who had come down from Syria and Mesopotamia, and they'd gone down into Egypt. In ancient antiquity, we're talking, probably about 2200 BC, something of that nature. They went down into Egypt. They were probably economic migrants, much the same as the Israelites were when they went down into Egypt, with all of their corn trading with the Pharaoh of Egypt. And the Hyksos took over Lower Egypt. That's Lower Egypt is the sort of Nile Delta, the north of Egypt. They took it over. They conquered it, basically. They conquered the peoples. They became the controlling authority. And they became thoroughly Egyptianized. I mean, if you look at the Hyksos peoples, their language, their culture, their architecture, pretty much they are Egyptians. They became Egyptians at the very least. And in their religion, they revered the same gods as Egypt. They sort of concentrated on different gods. So they revered Seth more than Osiris. Seth being the brother of Osiris, but Seth was more the god of war, whereas Osiris was more the god of fertility and resurrection, as it were. So Set or Seth is the equivalent of the Israelite Shaddai, who was also the god of destruction. And if you don't know it, I think I mentioned this in one of my other talks or lectures, but the Israelites never had just one God. Their God had several names and attributes. He was Yahweh, he was El, he was Elohim, he was the Adon, and he was also Shaddai, the god of destruction, the equivalent of Seth. And the Hyksos probably venerated Sekhmet as well, because up in the Nile Delta there's an awful lot of statues of Sekhmet, the lion goddess, the warrior goddess of Egypt. So almost the sort of partner of Set and Sekhmet, the god and the goddess of war, the warriors. And this is obvious from Leontopolis. Leontopolis is again in the Nile Delta. It's one of the ancient cities of Egypt. And as the name might suggest, Leontopolis was the city of the lions because they found so many statues of Sekhmet there, the lion goddess. And it was known as the Hyksos camp. So it originally had been a Hyksos city. And nowadays it's called Tel Yehudia, the city of the Jews. Why? Because Anias IV, he was a priest of Jerusalem, went down to Leontopolis and he built a temple there, a Jewish temple, a copy of the Temple of Jerusalem in the 2nd century BC. So you see this link between the ancient Hyksos city and the new Jewish city that was built there in the 2nd century BC. So the Hyksos, they were known as in the original Egyptian, I mean, Hyksos is a Greek rendering of their name. In the original Egyptian, they were called the Haikakasut, the shepherd kings. Now, modern Egyptologists will quite often disagree with this. They'll say it means the foreign kings because, well, here's the glyphs. And if you can see in the second name on the right-hand side, you'll see the Three Hills glyph. And that Three Hills glyph is a determinative, which often means foreign people, the foreign lands. Because Egypt didn't have any hills, and that's got hills, it's the foreign lands. And these Hyksos people came from Syria. They were Asiatics. And therefore they were the foreign kings. Well, that's what's said. But hold on a minute here. Manetho, this is the 3rd century BC Greco-Egyptian chronicler. He said that the name means shepherd. And captive as well, but it means shepherd. And the Egyptian language was spoken at that time. Manetho probably spoke Egyptian, and he said that the name means shepherd. And plus, if you look at the first word here, Haikal, so we've got Haikal and Kasut in these names, left to right, Haika, Kasut. The first name has a shepherd's crook, which is sort of prima facie evidence that the name actually refers to shepherds, and that Manetho was correct. So anyway, Manetho calls them the shepherd kings, just as the Israelites were also shepherds in Egypt. And they were sort of powerful people. I mean, they're said to be just mere shepherds with flocks of sheep, but quite often within the Torah text, you can see that these Israelites were fairly powerful. So let's have a look at the similarities between the Hyksos Exodus and the Israelite Exodus. So both of these groups of people were known as shepherds, as we've just seen. And a king of theirs was called Jacob, or Jacob. So yes, you're obviously probably familiar with Jacob, one of the patriarchs of the Torah, but did you know that there was a pharaoh called Jacob as well? And here's his cartouche. So he was called Jacob. Reading left to right, we have the two reed glyphs. Ya is how it's pronounced. And then we have the sort of cup that follows it. And that's a K. Then the boot is a B. And the arm is an A. So Yakaba. The same name as Jacob or Jacob in the Aramaic. Now the wavy lines at the end of this cartouche, they are either a determinative, which tells you what the name sort of means, or they are the consonant M. So we can either derive from this Yakobam, or we can derive Jacob, who is something to do with water, because they are, the three wavy lines often mean water. So there's another similarity with between the Hyksos and the Israelites. They both had a king or a leader called Jacob. And in the book, actually, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, I go through quite a few of the other patriarchs, names you're probably not familiar with, which have very deep similarities with the names of the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. So there's quite a few of these pharaohs that sound very similar to the biblical patriarchs. So they wore earrings, hair ringlets, and they were circumcised, both of these peoples. Now for the Jews, you'll probably understand that they were circumcised. Well, so were the Egyptians. They used hair ringlets. Well, you'll know that for the Jews, but hair ringlets were used at Heliopolis to denote the priests of Heliopolis. They had curly side locks of hair, exactly the same as modern Jews do today. And they wore earrings. Now, you might say that Israelites, Jews, don't wear earrings, but they did in the past. So in Genesis 35:4, the Israelites are told to bury their earrings in the ground. That was the royal family, as it were. That was the family of Jacob, I think it was. And in Exodus 32:2, the people of the Israelites are told to give their earrings, and so they can make the golden calf during the Exodus. And so, yes, they used to wear gold earrings, but they don't anymore because it was commanded that they shouldn't. But at that time, both of these peoples, the Hyksos and the Israelites, both wore earrings, they both had hair ringlets, and they were both circumcised. Another similarity, they were both involved in a war with the Egyptians. So the Hyksos were involved in this civil war with the Upper Egyptians down in Thebes, because they had taken over the north of Egypt, Lower Egypt, and there was continual conflict for quite a number of years and decades with the Egyptians in the south. So they had never conquered the Egyptians in the south. And the Israelites were also in a conflict with the Egyptians. Now it's portrayed as slaves and masters, but there was still this conflict between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And if you look at the story a little bit closer, it's clear that it's not quite a slave and master conflict, because the Israelites plundered the Egyptians and killed their firstborn, which is not quite the story you're often told, but there we go. That is what it says in the Exodus event. So Exodus 12:29 is where the Israelites kill all of the firstborn of the Egyptians. And in Exodus 12:36, it says that the Israelites spoiled the Egyptians, which doesn't quite make sense, but the word being used is natsal, and natsal also means plundered. So before they left on the Exodus, the Israelites plundered the Egyptians and took all of their gold and their silver. We'll look at this in a minute. Took all of their wealth and took that on the Exodus. And a lot of that wealth they used to make the tabernacle, of course. Okay, another similarity, storms and darkness for 3 days. Well, you probably understand the storms and darkness from the Exodus account. But the Egyptians, the Hyksos, when they went on their Exodus, they had the same problem. And we have this from the Tempest Stela, I should say, where Ahmose I, who was the southern pharaoh who ejected the Hyksos out of Egypt, he wrote this stela giving the details of this Exodus. And it says that there was storms and darkness for 3 days. Storm that had never before been seen in Egypt. And that happened, well, Ahmose I, we're talking about 1580 odd BC, something like that. So just over 300 years before the classical date of the Exodus. And that just happens to be coincident with the eruption of Thera, Santorini, the island of Santorini out in the Mediterranean. So we've mentioned this on one of the previous talks, I think it was, where in about 1600 BC, Thera Santorini exploded. It was the largest volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean basin in recorded history. It affected the whole of the east of the Mediterranean basin. And so, yes, there would have been storms and darkness, and sometimes these eruptions cause thunderstorms as well, so there may well have been hail and storms, but certainly darkness for 3 days, with all of the ash coming out of Santorini. And so for the Hyksos, we have this record of storms and darkness for 3 days, and in the biblical account we have this mention of storms and darkness for 3 days. The same event. And then another, well, we've sort of touched on it already, another event is the ashfall. Now, we've already mentioned the ashfall from the Hyksos. That came from Santorini in 1600 BC. But did you know that one of the plagues of Egypt was also an ashfall? So this one is not known so much. So this comes from the Exodus account, of course. And we'll have a quick quote here from Exodus. "The Lord said unto Moses, Take handfuls of ashes from a furnace, and sprinkle it towards the heavens in the sight of Pharaoh. And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout all the lands of Egypt." There could be no better description of the long-range fallout of pumice and ash from the eruption of Santorini. It is a perfect description. And yes, the dust that came out of Santorini would have contained silica shards because it's a volcano. And indeed, these will cause boils and blains on the skin. And with the air being too thick to breathe, as Josephus Flavius says, he writes his own version of this story. So that, as Josephus says, many people were inwardly consumed. Well, that's exactly what happened. Same happened after the eruption of Mount St. Helens, as you can see here, with the air being too thick to breathe. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, and many people fell sick because of the breathing in the dust from the volcano, which can contain silica shards. And there was so much of this ash that on the island, this is the island of Santorini where it came from, there was 60 meters thick layer of ash on the island. That's the white band you can see on this particular photo. And all of that ash spread out across the eastern Mediterranean. It's been found in Anatolia, it's been found in Egypt, in the archaeology of Egypt. So we know that this dust fell upon Egypt, just as the Exodus story says. Moses said, "Take handfuls of ashes from a furnace and sprinkle it towards the heavens in the sight of Pharaoh, and it shall become small dust in all of the land of Egypt." And it did. It is a perfect description of the eruption of Santorini. And then another of the plagues, there was another of the events of the Exodus. There was a pillar of smoke and fire, which guided the Israelites. And again, this is most probably the eruption of Thera Santorini. Now, the Israelites wouldn't have been able to see this, of course, from Egypt, but we have records from the Greeks that indicate that sailors were sailing out across the Mediterranean and saw this island erupting. And what they would have seen is exactly this, a pillar of fire and smoke, just as it says in the Exodus event. And then another similarity with the Hyksos Exodus. In the Exodus story, the biblical Exodus story, it says the waters were parted. A famous event, I think you'll probably know from the Exodus. And what does it say about this? Well, it says here, the children of Israel went into the middle of the sea upon dry ground, and the waters were like a wall unto them. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and army of the Pharaoh, so there remained not even one of them. So here we have a story of the waters parting, allowing the Israelites to cross. So here we have a story of the waters parting to allow the Israelites to cross, and then the waters coming back in again after they had managed to cross and to consume all of the Egyptian army. Now, this was supposed to be a crossing of the Red Sea, but of course it wasn't the Red Sea. That's not what it says. The text actually says the Yam Suf, which doesn't really mean red at all. It means reeds. It was the Reed Sea, and we know where the Reed Sea was. It was on the Mediterranean coast. It wasn't down on the Red Sea. It was further north up on the Mediterranean coast. So here we have a story about the waters receding and coming back in again. So this was not a miracle. This was a tsunami. And it happened at the time of the Hyksos Exodus, because tsunamis are caused by volcanic eruptions. The eruption of Santorini out in the Mediterranean. And because of this huge eruption, the waters receded as they do before a tsunami. And so in this image here, you can see these people are the Egyptian army. And the water disappears, and they're quite amazed by, just as these people are amazed by the water suddenly receding. The sea just disappears, and there's all the fish flopping around on the sand. You could just go out and collect them. There's breakfast. So all of the Egyptian army looking at this miracle of the seas receding. But then, of course, the wall of water comes back in again, just as the Exodus account describes it, a wall of water. And you can see the wall of water here. That's that white line out on the horizon. That's the wall of water coming back in again. And the people on the beach, even here, in the 21st century, the people on the beach didn't know what it was. But that wall of water was going to come back in and consume them, and it did consume them. Those people on that beach standing there probably didn't survive that great wall of water, just as the Egyptian army did not survive that wall of water. So that's one of the Exodus events, and it comes from the history of the Hyksos people and their exodus out of Egypt. So, talking of people going out of Egypt, here's another similarity. It says in the biblical account that some 600,000 men went on this exodus, having been 430 years in Egypt. But if we look at the Hyksos equivalent, and this is from real history, the Hyksos Exodus says that 240,000 men left from Egypt, having been in Egypt for 511 years. Is that not the same? Hundreds of thousands of people who had been in Egypt for hundreds of years were now going on this exodus away from Egypt. And they set off from Pi Ramesses. You'll probably remember that. They all set off from Pi Ramesses. And they departed and they went to Jerusalem. Well, the Hyksos did exactly the same, because they set off from Avaris. And they went off to Jerusalem. And, okay, Pi Ramesses, Avaris, it's the same city. The city was originally called Avaris. It was a city of the Hyksos people. We'll see this in a minute. But then it was abandoned, and later on it was taken over by Ramesses the Great, and it was renamed as Pi Ramesses. So the Israelites and the Hyksos set off from the same city, and they both went to Jerusalem. Same story? I think it is. And they were a mighty military force. Now you might say, okay, the Israelites weren't, they were just slaves. But we've already seen they probably weren't slaves. They killed all the Egyptian firstborn, and they looted the whole of Egypt before they departed on this Exodus, as it says in the book of Exodus. And then Moses, of course, when some of them made a golden calf, he went off and killed 3,000 bull worshippers during the Exodus. Because Moses, I'm not sure if you know this, Moses was the chief army commander in command of the Egyptian army. Now, it doesn't say that in the Torah, but if you look at Josephus Flavius's account of the Exodus, he wrote his own separate sort of Torah known as Antiquities. In his version, Moses was the chief army commander in command of the Egyptian army, and probably still had quite a few of his army with him. And anyway, we know that the Jews were powerful and a mighty military force because they destroyed Jericho. The very next thing that happens, in the Exodus account is they went and destroyed Jericho. Now, was that a band of slaves doing that, or was that a large military force? And of course, this is where the whole of the Exodus story falls down, because there is no evidence at Jericho that the Israelites were involved in anything. And that's why many people say that the whole of the Exodus account is a load of nonsense. It's mythology. It's been fabricated because it's just been a story that's made up. But the funny thing is, there has been a lot of archaeology, of course, at Jericho. And it was determined, and you can see this in most of the reference books regarding Jericho. It was determined that Jericho was probably destroyed because the walls of Jericho did fall down, but it was probably destroyed in the 1570s BC by the Hyksos people of Egypt. And probably the best description of this is by Ahmed Osman. If you read Ahmed Osman's book, Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, I think it's in that one, where he gives 15 reasons, I think, why it was the Hyksos who destroyed Jericho. But of course, if the Israelites were the Hyksos, then the story is the same. It was the Hyksos Israelites who destroyed Jericho, but they weren't doing it in 1250 BC, which is the classical date for the Exodus story that everyone loves to hang on to. They were doing it in 1570 or 1580 BC when the Hyksos were thrown out of Egypt. It's the same event, just over 330 odd years earlier than is currently claimed. And here is the walls of Jericho falling down. The priests playing their trumpets and the walls fall down. It didn't happen like that, of course. There's a good reason for that. The trumpets were just a diversionary tactic so that people could get into the city. But there you go. That's another story. And do remember, these are what is called now black swan events. Events that are so improbable that nobody could invent the story because it's just beyond imagination. And this is not one black swan. This is a whole multitude of black swans. There is the darkness and the storms, the pillar of smoke and fire, the ashfall, the thick air, the tsunami. All of these events are lumped together. But how would any chronicler in that early era know that all of these events could have a single cause, a single source for all of these events? A volcano out in the Mediterranean so that it causes a tsunami. face facts, this has to be an eyewitness account. Otherwise you could not get all of these events together in one single account, one single story. So this must be real history. And if this is real history, the account of the Exodus is real history, then perhaps we can begin to trust the rest of the biblical story as being more reliable, more historical. Perhaps the rest of this story is historical as well. And I think it is. We've already discovered King David and King Solomon up in Tanis, in Zoan instead of Zion. And now we're beginning to see that the Exodus event is also based on real history. So the Torah is morphing from a complete mythology, a complete fabrication, into real history. But real Egyptian history, and that's the difference. It's real history out of Egypt. So why is this not admitted? I mean, the only thing we've changed is the date. The classical date is the 1250s BC, and now we've moved it back to the 1570s BC, maybe the 1590s. There's about a 20-year gap here between the eruption of Thera, which is thought to be about 1600 BC, and the Exodus event, which is thought to be about 1570 BC. Now, there's two possibilities here. Either because the gods were obviously angry. I mean, the gods caused the darkness, the tsunami, everything else that happened, the pillar of fire and smoke. The gods were angry and someone was to blame. So either this dispute between the Hyksos and the southern Egyptians festered for 30 years before they were thrown out of the country, or there's a slight discrepancy on the date. But we're talking nearly 4,000 years ago, and we're talking about a 30-year discrepancy. I think that circle can easily be squared there. It may well be exactly the same date. There may be a 20-year gap, and this civil war festered for a couple of decades, as indeed, as we'll see in a minute, the history actually says that this war had gone on for some time. So why is this not admitted? Well, it means that the Israelites were Egyptians. They were Hyksos Egyptians. They were a polytheistic people with their own kings, not patriarchs, with their own kings, their own pharaohs, and a large army. You see how this is changing the biblical story from the story of the subjugation as slaves. They were just poor people at the mercy of the evil Egyptians. But they weren't. They were the Hyksos. They were actually in charge of northern Egypt, lower Egypt, and they had subjugated the Egyptians. They were in charge themselves. They were the kings and the pharaohs themselves. That's how it changes this story. And that's why people don't want to admit these similarities. They don't want to admit that the Hyksos were indeed the Israelites. But we have this history from real history as we know it. This is, recorded back in the 3rd century by Manetho. He's a Greco-Egyptian chronicler called Manetho. And most of his texts have been lost. In fact, I think every text of his has been lost. But his history has come down to us via other chroniclers. So Africanus and another historian I can't remember, and also through Josephus Flavius, who have preserved the accounts of Manetho. So let's look at what Manetho says. And here is one of his accounts, and Manetho, through Josephus, said, "This whole nation was called the Hyksos, that is, the shepherd kings. For the first syllable, Hyk, according to their dialect, denotes a king. while the sos is a shepherd. These people, whom we have called kings and shepherds, kept possession of Egypt for 511 years. After this, the kings of Thebes, that's, southern Egypt, made an insurrection against the shepherds, and there was a terrible and long war between them. The shepherds were subdued by the king and were driven out of the other parts of Egypt and were shut up in a place that contained 10,000 acres named Avaris. And remember that Avaris is Pyramesy. It's the old name for Pyramesy. So here we have this foreign people. Remember, the Israelites were a foreign people that came down into Egypt who were called shepherds, and they were in Egypt for a number of 100 years, 400 years or so, and then they were driven out. Now, thus far, they've been driven out of Egypt and locked into a place called Avaris, Pyramesy. But Manetho goes on, and he says, Thumosis made an attempt to take them by force and siege, but despairing of taking Avaris by siege, they came to an agreement that they should leave Egypt and go wherever they wanted. After this agreement was made, they went away with their whole families and effects, not fewer in number than 240,000, and took their journey from Egypt through the wilderness for Syria. But because they were in fear of the Assyrians, who then had dominion over Asia, they built a city in Judea and called it Jerusalem. Familiar story? Yeah, it sounds rather biblical, doesn't it? But this is not from the Torah. This is from the history of Egypt by Manetho. And he's talking about the Hyksos kings, the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. And they were kicked out of Egypt, as we say, in about 1580 BC. And they went to Judea and built a city called Jerusalem. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities here, isn't there? A lot of similarities. So, well, let's have a look at those similarities. Let's look at the Torah's version. And the Torah will say, the children of Israel followed the word of Moses, and they borrowed from the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and cloth. And the Lord gave the Israelites favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent them such things as they required. How nice of them. And the Israelites spoiled the Egyptians. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men besides children. Now the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt was 430 years. Of course, there is a bit of mistranslation here, as there often is in these texts. So you'll see up the top there, it will say that the Israelites borrowed from the Egyptians. But the word that's being used is shoal, and borrowed can mean demanded. And I think the demanded version makes a lot more sense. Same with lent. Lent is the same word, shoal. It means demanded. And then the Israelites spoiled the Egyptians. Well, no, I think the word being used is natsal. And natsal also means plundered. And I think the plundered version makes much more sense. The Israelites plundered the Egyptians. That's why they got all of their silver and jewels and gold and cloth, because they were plundering the Egyptians. This is why I say that the Egyptians were a powerful nation who were still able to plunder the Egyptians before they left on their exodus. So they weren't subjugated slaves at all, and we'll see this again in a minute. They were in control of Lower Egypt. They were the pharaohs, they were the aristocrats of Lower Egypt. But for whatever reason, they were being thrown out of Egypt, probably because they were a small controlling force. It says 500,000 people here, but perhaps they were a small controlling force, like Britain was a small controlling force within India. The British Raj worked very well in India, but At the most, there were only 100,000, 150,000 British controlling the whole of India, with millions and millions of people. So when the Indian people sort of rose up and demanded independence, there was not a great deal that the British could do about it. And so they had to go on an exodus, and they did. The British people left India. And I think that's probably what happened here with the Hyksos Israelites in Egypt. They were a fairly small controlling aristocracy, maybe 150, 200,000 people. These numbers have been inflated, of course, in the historical texts. And they were controlling Egypt, but eventually the people sort of rose up and threw them out of Egypt, and they went on their exodus. So they weren't subjugated slaves at all. They were the controlling authority. We'll see why they were called slaves in a minute. And the historical account continues. Manetho, again through Josephus, he says, in another book, Manetho says that this nation of shepherds, that's the Hyksos, were also called captives in their sacred books. And this account is the truth, for the feeding of sheep was the employment of our forefathers in the most ancient of ages. And because they led a wandering life feeding sheep, they were called shepherds. Nor was it without reason that they were called captives by the Egyptians, since one of our ancestors, Joseph, told the king of Egypt that he was a captive, and afterwards sent for his brethren into Egypt by the king's permission. Okay, so let's pass that a little bit deeper. So if we look again, the top few lines, this is sort of Manetho saying. Manetho says that this nation of shepherds, the Hyksos, were also called captives in their sacred books. So they were called shepherds and captives. And then Josephus starts speaking himself, so now this is Josephus talking, and he says, and this account is the truth, for the feeding of sheep was the employment of our forefathers in the most ancient ages. Josephus Flavius is patently saying that his forefathers, the Israelites, were the Hyksos. That's what he is saying in this particular text. The Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. That's why he says they were our forefathers. So we've not only demonstrated in the beginning of this talk, we've not only demonstrated that the Israelite exodus is exactly the same as the Hyksos exodus, but now Josephus Flavius says that these people, the Hyksos, were our forefathers. It could not be more clear than this that the Israelites were the Hyksos. And do remember that Josephus Flavius is Judaism's most definitely, Judaism's greatest historian. He is a man who took the Torah from the Temple of Jerusalem when it was destroyed in AD 70, and he had the oldest Torah, because the Torahs we have in history at present are not terribly old. The earliest extant Torah is about 1000 AD. It's fairly recent. Okay, we have the Septuagint as well before that, the Greek version. But in Aramaic, all of the Torahs are fairly recent. But Josephus Flavius took the original Torah from the Temple of Jerusalem, and his Torah was from at least 600 BC. He had a much earlier document to work with than anyone does today. And his version of that Torah, his Antiquities, is quite different to the current Torah that we use today. It has a lot of interesting, it's basically the same story, of course, but it has a lot of interesting asides which demonstrate a slightly different history for the Israelites. It's quite often indicating that the biblical patriarchs were important and powerful people. Moses, for instance, is said to be an army commander in command of the Egyptian army who defeated the Nubians and then married the Nubian queen, Tharbis. Now, none of that is present in the current extant Torah that we have today, but that's what Josephus said, copied from the previous Torah that came from the Temple of Jerusalem. Anyway, that aside, why the silence on this? We've demonstrated that the Hyksos are the Israelites. Josephus Flavius says that the Hyksos are the Israelites. So why the silence? By theologians, by historians, by Egyptologists. Well, I can tell you one reason why there is a difference is because theologians don't know history and Egyptologists don't know theology. So there is a gap for starters, but it's deeper than that, and we'll go into this a little more later. Well, I think this particular lecture is getting rather too long, so perhaps I should stop it here in what will become part 1, and we'll pick up with part 2 a little bit later. So I do hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this talk, and I hope to see you back again with part 2 a little bit later on. Thank you.